So this week's chapter is what it's interesting about it is it's actually like more real world stuff and less book stuff in some ways. This is something we use at the college. It's used at any place I've ever worked that's bigger than a small company. So like I don't use it at my small business. But the idea is it's what's called responsibility accounting. What happens is as businesses get bigger, you have to kind of like you want to, if you're the business owner, try to control everything. But the bigger it gets, the more you just have to start trusting other people. That's just the way it goes. So as you decentralize, meaning take power away from a single core person, you have to give power to various business segments. In other words, hire managers and trust them to do their job. But you don't trust them that much because you have to, be able to measure whether or not they're doing their job. So let's see. So anyway, this is just some stuff from the book. These are some advantages of decentralizing. People always say like they want to start a business and then like retire by the time they're 30 and they're going to hire managers. What most people don't realize is if you're going to do that, you actually have to trust other people to run your business with your money, and it's scary. And so that's what decentralizing does. It takes power away from you, gives it to other people. Here's the problems, and we see this happening even at the college. We're not a giant institution, but we often duplicate costs. What I mean by that is anybody ever used our computer commons lab? Of course you have, because I made you do tests there, right? Some people ask, why do we have that when the media center right across the sidewalk there also has computers, right? And then there's a lab in the math science building. And so these questions of duplicating costs and achieving goal congruence, they call it here, which is like each division at the college is sometimes kind of fighting in their own right to support their own goals rather than necessarily supporting the overall goals of the college. An example of that might be like I get judged on the number of successful completers in my program. Is it easier for me to go out and find new students who wouldn't have come to EAC, or is it easier for me to go poach a general studies student, right? And show them, here's why you'd want to major in business or whatever. And the answer is usually it's way easier to get people that are already at the college who are undecided about their major. Anyway, so that's a disadvantage. As we decentralize, then the different divisions start sort of competing against each other, which can be good if we're competing in such a way as to make each other do better, but not so good if they're just poaching from each other all the time. Anyway, so when we do this, what we have to do is what's called responsibility accounting, which is our way of sort of measuring how each division's doing and making sure that we're sort of encouraging them to do the right things. Last week we talked about budgets, and that controlling is this way of saying, are we staying on budget? And so responsibility accounting is another form of budgeting, I guess you would say, or of measuring outcomes. So these are the types of responsibility centers in business, typically speaking. We have cost, revenue, profit, and investment centers. So some managers are only responsible for controlling costs. They can't really control revenue. In a revenue center, the manager is only responsible for generating revenues and has very little control over costs. So the reason this matters is we don't want to judge or measure a manager against things that they have zero control over, right? So if I don't get to control revenue and my only real control is over controlling costs, then I should be judged on that and be paid according to that. So there's a summary that's right out of the book to the different types of responsibility centers, which means, and again, what that means is what does the manager have responsibility for? Because that's going to adjust what we're measuring when we do our responsibility accounting. And so this is an important thing. If any of you guys ever end up running your own business or being in management, which I believe some of you will, this is where it really matters. This is our point of an evaluation system, and I believe it's the point even of the way we choose to pay people, okay, is we want to promote goal congruence and coordination. In other words, we want to set up our system so that it's getting people to do the things we need them to do rather than fight against each other. I've worked places where they pay you according to certain types of performance, and then they're surprised when people try to maximize that performance. And it's like, what did you expect people to do? If it affects their paycheck, they're going to do it. At the college, for example, um, they wanted to do online classes, and so they started offering people $3,000 to convert a regular class over to online classes. Well, math teachers were like, but the business teachers were like, that seems like a. So we converted like all our classes to online, which was awesome for business students, except that if you want to take our program online, you still can't get your math done. You still have to figure out a way to come in. So they have to somehow, and you have to set these goals so that they encourage performance of what you need done. Does that make sense? It's really an important part of this. Otherwise, because people will set up these weird goals that just don't matter very much. All right, here's the downside is almost always these types of measurements are what are called lagging or lag indicators. And so you have to figure out what the lead indicators are as well if you're a good manager. So a lag indicator means you look at that and say, oh, a change in this is telling us something that happened in the past. Okay. So even like looking at our revenue and expense changes, those are lagging indicators, right? We're looking back at the last period, the last month, the last quarter, and seeing how things have changed. We also need to say, hey, we've noticed that when this happens, so an example of a good leading indicator might be the number of meaningful contacts a salesperson makes in a month. We know that that's going to lead to sales in the future. Okay. The problem with that is how do you get those reported in such a way that they're honest? Because of course your salesperson is going to tell you, yes, I made this many contacts. But most of us know there's better contacts and not better. Anybody who's been on a mission knows that there's days when you're like, yes, I'd had this many contacts and they were all trash. And other days where, because you were just going through the motions. All right, I'm moving on. All right, so I'm going to skip past. So a balanced scorecard is a way we try to measure these um, these responsibility measures. Okay, so what you really have to do in a real business is you have to break the business down into perspectives and then decide what your strategy is. A lot of times, if you hear of businesses doing vision statements and things like that, what they're trying to do is say, what are we really about? Um, and then you come up with, usually with a team of people, key performance indicators. In other words, what are we going to measure to see if we are being successful in that perspective? These are some common ones: financial, customer, internal business, learning and growth, but they could be different for every business. At the college, we've done that recently, right? And in essence, what we want to do is provide like a premier level education while being financially responsible. Like those are some of our big mission type statements. And so now we're asking ourselves, we're in this process of saying, well, what does that mean? What does fiscal responsibility look like, and what can we measure to see if we're actually being fiscally responsible? How can we hold a division chair accountable for that? How can we hold a dean accountable for that, and so forth? So that's what a balanced scorecard is it sort of looks at key performance indicators and how we're achieving them. All right, so we're getting down to the part where it's going to be what you're doing in class. Sorry, this was a lot of info because the nature of this chapter. So responsibility accounting is just these performance reports that are based on this balanced scorecard I was talking about. The big deal here is that a manager should not be evaluated on items he or she cannot control. We shouldn't be judging people. They probably shouldn't be judging me as a division chair on revenue generation. I don't really have much authority to do that, but I do have some authority over cost control in my area, although it's minimal because I can't really get rid of, like, I'm not allowed to fire people, so which was our biggest cost. So if I were to say, hey, I think if we want to save real money, let's get rid of one teacher, I can't make that decision. And so I have this limited scope of financial control. They would probably judge me more on things like what percentage of our students are successfully completing, right? Because that's something I might be able to do something about. But they have to be careful because a few years ago, they really put the focus on DFW rates, in other words, what percentage of students were getting D's, F's, or failing. And guess what student or teachers did in response? They just made their classes easier to pass, rather than saying, how do we improve DFW rates but maintain a certain level of academic rigor? It was just like, well, that's easy. I'll just make it easy to pass. All right. All right. So I'm going to just kind of skip to these. Here's what a performance report looks like, and this is the sort of stuff you're going to face in the homework these weeks. So a cost center, remember, a cost center can't control revenues. It can only control costs. So this is what a cost center's performance report might look like. These are things they might be judged on. Various costs. You have the actual results, the amount of the budget, some budget variance, and then oftentimes there's a variance as a percentage. And that's it. So I think this will be pretty easy in the sense that, like, the math of it's not hard. I think the unfavorable favorable thing confuses people a little bit still. Remember, with costs, if you are lower than the budget, then that's favorable. And if you're higher than the budget, that's unfavorable. Justin, you had a question?
Yeah, what's the U and the F for on the flexible budget variance?
So that's the unfavorable or favorable. So something people weren't getting this week on the Excel assignment, they were showing negatives in the variance, and variance is always shown as an absolute value. So it's all, if you remember that from math, that means it's positive. Okay, it's just the difference between the two values, and then they're labeled as unfavorable or favorable. So in the case of costs, when our actual results are higher than our budget, we're going to say that's unfavorable. You had more costs than what you budgeted for. In this case, the cost was, there it is, the cost was less than the budget, so they're going to call that favorable. So in a cost center where the manager really only has control over costs, what we're saying is, okay, we budgeted 30,000, but you actually spent 31,350. That's a 4.5% unfavorable variance, okay, or a $1,350 unfavorable variance. Most places I've worked, in essence, give you some sort of a range, right? You can be plus or minus 5% and you're okay, or something like that. One place I worked, what they did is they labeled you as green, yellow, or red. So if you were within this range, you were green, which meant you're okay. Yellow means you're on the edge of your costs becoming out of control, and red means you're out of control. And if you don't do something about it, then you're a naughty boy, you get fired. Anyway, so that's what a performance report for a cost center might look like. Revenue centers are going to focus on revenues. So, for example, when I worked for Edward Jones Investments, we were a revenue center. They dictated from corporate headquarters, actually as a partnership. So partnership headquarters, they dictated that I would have an office with a secretary. They wanted all those things. So I couldn't control any of that. And so all I could really control was revenue. Okay, the more I sold, the more I did. So here they just judge. You can see that this is just sales revenue. That's all their report looked like. When I worked for Edward Jones, they had other things like number of contacts I was making weekly, and then even the types of items I was selling, because certain items have higher margins, so they wanted to push us to selling certain things. Okay. Again, though, the way it's always laid out is you'll see the actual versus the flexible budget and some variance between that. And this one, they have a static budget. So this is just kind of carrying forward concepts from last chapter into these performance reports. You remember, a static budget is a budget that's made before you do anything. And then in that static budget, you break down, say, revenue on a per sales basis. And then in a flexible budget, we take the actual sales volume and multiply it by that revenue per the revenue per sale in the static budget. That way you get the variance between the flexible budget and the actual sales, and the variance between the static budget and the flexible budget. Again, we just learned this in the last chapter. Hopefully you felt like you got a grasp on it. Anybody have a question? Good. Maybe good, or maybe you're just like, I don't know what to ask, so I'm just going to be quiet. All right. Profit centers have control over revenue and expenses. So some business segments, maybe if I owned a McDonald's franchise and I hired a manager to run one of my stores, I would consider that a profit center. They have to control both revenues and expenses. And I'd be asking that manager, what are you doing, right, to increase revenues, and what are you doing to control expenses? So you'll see that this starts to look a lot like an income statement. It has revenues and expenses on it. You can see that this manager had a really nice favorable variance on revenue. So when we're managing revenue and we're trying to figure out if it's a favorable variance or an unfavorable variance, it's the opposite of expenses. So in the case of revenue, if our actual is higher than our budget, we call that favorable, right? Having more revenue than what we budgeted for is a good thing. But with expenses, having more expenses than what we budgeted for, that's an unfavorable thing. So it takes a little bit of talking yourself through it to understand it. Recognize revenues we want to be higher, so when they are, that's favorable, and when they're lower, that's unfavorable. With expenses, it's the opposite. Expenses we want to be lower, so when they're lower, that's favorable, but when they're higher than the budget, that's unfavorable. So this guy, this manager, his nice big fat budget variance in revenue overcompensated for the expense variables, right? So in the end, he made $50,800 more in segment margin than budgeted. So that'd be a good thing. If I was his boss, I'd like to give him a bonus, right? We'll give him 10% of that margin. He'll get a $5,000 bonus this quarter or month or whatever. Actually, if you places like Walmart, so store managers, about half of their compensation is actually made up on bonuses that are based on responsibility reporting. So a Walmart store manager, the average one makes about $100,000 to $120,000 a year, but only about 60,000 of that is guaranteed salary, and the rest comes from how well they are beating revenue projections or budgets and controlling expenses. The better they do that, the more additional compensation they receive. There's another form of the same idea. They're just working on variable expenses there. And then finally, investment centers, they usually use things like return on investment or residual income. Here's a couple of formulas that you've actually already learned. You learned them in Accounting 1, but they're here again. These are ways they judge investment centers. So an investment center is just, if you think about it, it's kind of like above a profit center in the sense that now not only are they concerned with revenue and expenses, but they're concerned with how this expenditures on big things like, so this might be a regional or a district manager for Walmart who is controlling where they're putting in new stores and things like that, right? They're controlling investment for the company. So we're going to be interested in things like return on investment, which involves our operating income, which is revenue and expenses, and the amount of assets that we have. Again, in a small business like mine, I'm the everything center, right? I'm the investment center, the profit center, the cost center. I control all of those things. But if I were to open up another storage in another town and hire a manager, I would have to decide how much authority to give that person, and then based on that authority, how to judge them. Okay, judge their, not them as a human being, but judge their performance. Okay, so that's what this chapter is about. Any other questions that sort of came up in your mind as I was going through it? Nope. Okay. Sarah, you have a look on your face, but I'm not sure how to read it. That's a joke because I can't see your face. All right.
That scared me.
She's like, but I have cardboard taped over my camera so that the government can't get into my home. How could you possibly see my face? Anyway, sorry, Sarah. I was just teasing you. Okay, so any other questions or thoughts on stuff coming up this week?
Am I gonna get docked if I turn the Excel in late?
Probably if you turn the Excel in late, I will just have the school kick you out. No, so So I'm trying to be flexible, Sarah. Like, I recognize that this whole change has just made a change for everybody. Some people are like right on top of it. Others are running behind. It's okay. So the short answer is no, I won't dock you any points for turning stuff in late.
Okay, thanks.
The long answer is please don't let yourself get in a hole because it's hard to dig out once you're in it. That's not just for you, Sarah, that's for everybody. Anybody who, you know, I recognize that most of you are like, I did not choose to do online classes. The coronavirus stole my life or something like that. But it's what where we're at, I guess, that we have to just be flexible. Hey, I have a question for you guys, and I don't want any names or anything, but maybe I do actually, but are all of your teachers being pretty flexible and pretty cool and trying to work with you, or do you have any teachers that are being like not and are making it really difficult for you guys? Okay, because if you do, we've been instructed to try to really make it work for you guys, and we just, I've heard one person, a report of a teacher who was just like, sorry, this isn't my problem, and kind of like leaving the student out to, you know, hanging out to dry, and that's just not okay. And so if that's happening to you, I'm not the person to report it to, although if you told me, I would pass it up the chain. But probably, do you guys know JP? I don't know if any of you have met JP, James Pryor. He's kind of the guy that I think would be, because he works in counseling and he's not anybody's boss. So he's the type that could kind of be cool and call the teacher and like try to like bridge the divide. Whereas if we call the deans, like my dean would just go chew somebody up and spit them out, I think, if she found out they were doing that. So she's very nice, but I wouldn't want to fight her. I wouldn't want to meet her in a back alley. Okay. Anyway, that's Dr. Lawhorn. She's pretty awesome. Any other questions? Sarah had the courage to ask one. Good job, Sarah. You're like, there's nothing courageous about asking a question. I don't know. I think it was courageous, Sarah. If we're good, then we're good, and I won't force you to ask other questions. Okay. So again, there's a recording of this. If there was something we talked about in here and you're like, oh, I want to roll back and check that out. Also, you know that I have my full things recorded. And I'm sorry, apparently last week there was some issue with the audio on the guided assignment for 23 or something, but I got it fixed. What's crazy is I just recorded that recently to make sure it was good, and it just, the audio screwed up somehow. So anyway, if that's it, then have a great day, and thank you for taking the time to sign in. And I miss you guys. As much as it's nice to work from home, it's just nice to be in class and see everybody's faces and tease you in person instead of teasing you online. Anyway, so have a great day, and bye. Justin, we're alone at last. Hey, what's up? Hold
I just had a couple.
on. Let me